Tell me you remember the PlayStation Portable, the PSP. It's got to be one of the most beautifully designed handheld consoles ever. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that this bad boy was adored by gamers around the world. But after an impressive decade-long run and a bunch of different variations, Sony would ultimately cancel the project. So what the heck happened to the PSP? The first time I ever played a PSP was at my best mate's place so many years ago. And I will never forget the absurdity of playing Grand Theft Auto on this tiny little thing. It looked freaking incredible. But all the games in the world couldn't stop Sony from shutting the PSP down. So we're going to go back and take a look at one of the biggest rivalries in gaming history. Plus, we're going to meet the 3 Sony legends that brought this iconic device to life. And most importantly, we're going to find out why after so many years, Sony cancelled the PlayStation Portable. Because you're watching Legendary Tech. The 1990s was a wild decade for computer technology. Computers were no longer reserved for work and business, and PCs, with the help of Microsoft's Windows, were popping up at homes all around the world, and playing video games at home was on the rise. Thanks to the massive success of the PlayStation 1, Sony were dominating the at-home gaming market, and Sony Computer Entertainment were a force to be reckoned with. The first PlayStation was a massive step up in gaming and technology. Some of my favorite games of all time were first released on the PS1. Spyro, Crash Bandicoot, Metal Gear Solid. These games and the PS1 defined a generation of gamers. And Sony kept up their winning streak in the early 2000s with the PlayStation 2. This iconic rectangle would go on to sell over 160 million units and become the best-selling gaming console of all time. But there was one market they had yet to take over.
After building tremendous equity in the home console space, we began to look at the mobile market.
But if they wanted to win in handheld gaming, they'd have to take on a pretty big giant.
Now you can have all the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy.
With the insane popularity of the Game Boy product line, Nintendo had cemented themselves as the kings of handheld gaming. And according to one account, a Sony executive said that the Game Boy's success should have been a Sony product. Sony were very aware of their competition. Now, handheld electronic devices weren't a new thing for Sony. They had massive success with the Walkman, and so they considered a handheld gaming console was just a natural step for them. So using the PlayStation brand that already had so much credibility, Sony started development on what would become the PSP. But taking on Nintendo wasn't going to be easy. And with the release of the Nintendo DS on the horizon, Sony really had to make something special, which requires an expert builder. This is Masa Shitani, and he served as the Chief Technical Officer at Sony Computer Entertainment during the years of the PSP. This guy is legendary, and he led the technical teams that worked on the PlayStation 1 all the way up to the PlayStation 4. That sounds like too much responsibility, honestly. And if Sony was going to build a device that could compete with Nintendo, Masa was the guy to do it. Not only did Masa lead the team that would be charged with making the PSP's hardware, but he also played a crucial role in getting Sony's online services working. This was the early 2000s, and the internet was booming, and Sony knew that internet connectivity would be a big deal for the PSP. And it really didn't take long for Sony to show the world and Nintendo the beast they had created. At E3 2003, Sony announced their upcoming PlayStation Portable. This sleek piano black handheld console featured a 4.8 by 272 pixel display resolution, with Sony's 4 signature PlayStation buttons, a directional pad, and an analog nub or joystick. On the top was a USB 2 port, and on the back was a universal media disk drive. But the really impressive stuff was on the inside. The PSP would use 2 333MHz CPUs, a main CPU and a media engine, as well as a GPU running at 166MHz, and 32 megabytes of RAM. The 1800 mAh battery would provide about 3 to 6 hours of gameplay, and 4 to 5 hours of video playback. And their strategy was pretty clear. Push the PlayStation brand into the handheld gaming market with a device that offered console quality gaming and entertainment. Would Sony be able to take all their rich experience in console gaming and apply that to a tiny form factor device? But more importantly, would the PlayStation Portable be enough to compete with Nintendo? Yo, I don't know about you, but I'm a sucker for legendary tech. And if you are too and you haven't hit subscribe yet, be a legend, hit subscribe. Now let's get back to the PSP. Ka-chow. The very first PlayStation Portable officially launched in Japan on December 11th, 2004. And in 2005, it was officially released in North America for around $250 USD, around $100 higher than the Nintendo DS. The The PSP was off to the races, and within 10 months of its global release, Sony claimed that they had sold 10 million units. Not bad for a premium handheld device. But Sony was super aware of the competition they had with Nintendo. And to try and compete with the DS, they made some pretty strategic marketing moves. Not only was the PSP a more premium device, but it was marketed to a slightly older demographic than the DS. This was for gamers, people who loved video games. And Sony really relied on the success of the PlayStation to try and sell the PSP. Everything you love about PlayStation in your pocket. And to take advantage of the PSP's epic hardware, Sony needed games. Actually, Sony needed a curator of games. This is Shuhei Yoshida. He joined Sony way back in 1986 and became one of the first team members of the PlayStation team. Yoshida had an epic understanding of game development, and it was his connection and relationship to game developers that made the PSP library so high quality from day one. And boy, did the PSP have some bangers. Games like God of War and Ratchet and Clank and Jak and Daxter, as well as Gran Turismo PSP, Sony came in swinging with first-party games. All of them a little edgier, a little darker than the games Nintendo was pushing. Its third-party games like Tekken and Kingdom Hearts, Kingdom Hearts, man, as well as Final Fantasy and the FIFA series. Not only did all these titles contribute massively to the success of the PSP, but they also influenced a generation of gamers. And of course, who could forget GTA Liberty City Stories? Released in 2005, it became the best-selling PSP game, selling about 8 million copies worldwide. The release of GTA on the PSP proved that an open-world 3D game was possible on a handheld device. The competing DS may have had a game library that was more general market, but the PSP undeniably had games that were made for gamers. And Yoshida played an important part of curating that game library. Plus, it also has to be said that the PSP was more than just a gaming console. In an era pre-smartphones, the idea of a single device that you could listen to music on, watch movies on, browse the internet on, is kind of insane. It's kind of wild. Sony had truly taken their experience across so many different industries, media, technology, gaming, and put it into one single device. It's without a doubt that the PSP was a commercial success. And over its lifespan of 2004 to 2014, Sony would release multiple variations of the PSP, adding performance updates and new functionality. But at its core, the PSP's mission stayed the same. It was an all-in-one entertainment device. And over its decade-long lifespan, it sold over 80 million units. 80 million people had one of these. But although the PSP was a massive success, it also was in a little trouble. See, compared to Nintendo's figures of 150 million units plus for the DS, the PSP would ultimately come in second place. Nintendo's focus on the every person, on the average gamer, really paid off for the DS. The Nintendo DS undeniably appealed to a general audience, to young families. In this handheld console race, Nintendo had won out against Sony's strategy. But on top of that, the situation started getting a little trickier for Sony. Sony had pushed heavily that the UMD, the Universal Media Disc, was the next phase for content consumption. But only after a few years of the PSP's release, retailers stopped stocking UMDs, specifically movies on the UMD format. And pretty quickly, one of Sony's main selling points started to fade away. Their vision of the UMD being a new standard for digital content didn't pan out the way they thought. And at the same time, smartphones were on the rise. Both iPhone and Android devices were now making it possible to watch all your favorite movies, stream and listen to your favorite songs, and connect to the internet, all in a single handheld device. And mobile gaming was on the rise too. Sony released the PSP 2000 and 3000 to try and keep up with these changes. And eventually they released the PSP Go, moving the PSP away from the UMD format and making it a download-only device. That sounds pretty familiar, huh? On top of Nintendo owning the market and technology changing so quickly, something else was causing some pain at Sony. Sony acknowledged that piracy had taken a massive chunk out of their software sales. With the use of memory sticks, jailbreaking the PSP got crazy popular. Here you had a high-powered gaming device. Mixed with jailbreaking equaled unlimited possibilities. And as much as Sony tried to keep up with these new jailbreaks and try and patch these issues, piracy of games for the PSP took a massive chunk out of Sony's revenue stream, which ultimately started a vicious cycle. Third-party game developers were bailing out on the PSP ecosystem, which meant less new titles on the PSP. Sony ended up halting the shipments of PSPs in 2014, all part of a push to sell their PSP Vita. Sony had moved on, and so did the gaming industry. It wouldn't take long for Sony to shut down the PSP product line completely. A pretty common tale in technology. Ken Kutaragi joined Sony in 1975 and would eventually become a key figure and executive at Sony. Many refer to Ken as the father of the PlayStation. He really led the way and had the dream for what Sony could do in gaming. Before they were rivals, Ken collaborated with Nintendo to help them build the sound chip for the SNES, the Super Nintendo, even though other executives at Sony were skeptical that they should enter the gaming industry. But it was Ken who pushed Sony into the gaming market. And the launch of the PlayStation, the very first PlayStation, was a huge win for Sony. And in the PSP, Ken saw big dreams of what could be. He saw the PSP as the Walkman of the 21st century. He saw the PSP as more than just a gaming console. He saw it as a portable media device. If it wasn't for Ken's vision, Sony would have never had the PlayStation, and we would have never gotten the PSP. But truly, all good things do come to an end, and the PSP is no exception. And sure, selling over 80 million units in its lifetime is insane, but I don't think that's what made the PSP special. I still get so much nostalgia scrolling through those menus. Its interface sounds are iconic, and its gaming experience, although limited, is still one of the best on a portable device. Which is why I have a feeling that people are so excited and keen for Sony to do a true handheld gaming device, to follow up the PSP with today's technology. But even if they ultimately decide to do it, it's going to be pretty hard to beat the feeling of gaming on the PSP.